Next, from Springfield, we head to a Senate Appropriations Committee hearing as the governor's state budget director, Scott Harry, takes questions on the governor's proposed fiscal year 2018 budget. This runs about 45 minutes.
My name is Scott Harry. I'm the Director of Governor's Office of Management and Budget, and to my left is Alexis Sturm, my Chief of Staff. Thank you for your opening remarks. I'm pleased to be before the committee this morning and to brief you on the highlights of the Governor's fiscal year 2018 recommended budget. The fiscal year 2018 budget assumes the continued deposit of revenues into the Fund for the Advancement of Education and the Commitment to Human Services Fund, totaling $968 million as provided under current law, but reflects the classification of these funds and the Budget Stabilization Fund as part of the general funds. In the Governor's fiscal year 2018 budget, the Governor recommends proposals to reduce spending by approximately $3 billion in all funds next year. In the areas of pensions, group health insurance, procurement, selling the James R. Thompson Center, implementing a new initiative called the Community Reinvestment Program, and employee compensation. For changes to pensions, a $1.3 billion savings. Some of these proposals you're familiar with: end salary spiking, capping high salary employees' pensionable costs, phasing in assumption of changes, and the new component this year that the Governor is recommending is a new Tier 3 option. Right now, when new employees start, the only option available to them is a Tier 2 option, which is a defined benefit plan only. Under the Governor's proposal, it would add a new Tier 3, sometimes referred to as a hybrid plan, for the employee to choose from. So a new employee would either have two options, either the existing Tier 2 or the Tier 3. The Tier 3 includes a new element, which is a defined contribution option that will give the employee another choice. So for new employees, if they choose the Tier 3 option, if they're currently in Social Security, that would be only a defined contribution plan. But for those employees that would participate in Social Security, that are not participating in Social Security, then that new Tier 3 would also have a small defined benefit plan. For the defined contribution plan, similar to a 401k plan, the employee minimum is 4%, and the employer contribution range is from 2 to 6%. The Governor also proposes changes to state employee group health insurance, as the current plan is overly generous and unaffordable. These proposed changes will bring benefit levels more in line with the private sector plan and to a level that the state can afford. Changes to procurement. The existing processes are cumbersome and inefficient. It proposes to streamline the process while keeping safeguards in place. It also implements best practices and enhances cooperative purchasing. Selling the James R. Thompson Center in Chicago would result in net proceeds for the state while providing significant benefits, including a new recurring revenue stream for the city of Chicago and Cook County once this land is returned to the property tax rolls. For the Community Reinvestment Program, currently the Department on Aging administers the Community Care Program that provides assistance to older adults so that they can have a better quality of life and remain in their homes as long as possible. In the budget, the Department proposes a long-term and sustainable strategy for continuing to provide these services to older adults at a lower cost by implementing the Community Reinvestment Program for the non-Medicaid portion of that population. The administration is also continuing with a wage freeze for general and step increases for bargaining unit employees, and instead the administration is offering merit pay bonuses for all employees. Now for the spending highlights in the Governor's recommended budget: education, fully funding K-12 education for the second year in a row for general state aid, adding a $30 million increase increasing funding to early childhood by $50 million, fully funding regular and vocational transportation reimbursement line, as well as bilingual education. It also fully funds student assessments and adds $5 million for matching funds for a federal grant opportunity for broadband expansion and internet connectivity. For the higher education budget, the governor proposes a 10% increase, or $36 million, for the monetary award program over the FY15 funding level for that program to provide more students with financial assistance. It also proposes to fund universities and community colleges at 90% level of FY15, which also includes performance-based funding. At the Department of Corrections, there is funding in the proposed budget for 2 new life skills reentry centers. These centers will house offenders with 1 to 4 years left on their sentence. The centers will offer educational, job readiness, and problem-solving courses. These centers will be in Kewanee as well as Murfreesboro. There are also new funding in the budget for the inmates with mental health issues. The department's budget includes funding for new residential treatment units and a new inpatient facility. The state police, it funds 2 new cadet classes, one that would begin in July and the other one in the spring of 2018. Each class would start with 100 cadets, and the expected graduates would be 85 from each class, which would add a total of 170 new troopers. The Department of Human Services, it fully funds all consent decrees. It funds child care at the 185% level under a balanced budget agreement. Fully funds early intervention as well as the home services program. There's new money at Department of Veterans Affairs proposed for startup funding for the opening of the Chicago Veterans Home that is currently under construction. At Public Health, there is funding for the Childhood Lead Initiative to begin to address the childhood lead burden. Adding additional operational resources for the department to then serve additional children that have lead blood levels greater than 5 micrograms per deciliter. It also proposes to add $80 million in bond funding for lead abatement in both schools as well as in residences. The department's budget at Department of Public Health also includes recommended funding for them to develop an opioid preparedness and prevention strategy and a new system to track incidents of overdoses. At Department of Transportation, the governor's budget includes $2.2 billion pay-as-you-go road program, and the capital budget includes $550 million for deferred maintenance, as well as $400 million for technology, $150 million for a new Rasho inpatient treatment center for the Department of Corrections. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you, Director Harry. Please add Senators Murphy, Bennett, Hastings, Morrison, and Trotter to the roll. Senator Oberweis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have a quick question on the Tier 3 program that you mentioned. The 4% employee contribution is voluntary, or can they do 2%, 3%, anything they want, or 0 if they want, or is it automatic?
The 4% is what's being proposed as the automatic.
Automatic, okay. And then you also said the employer contribution would be 2 to 6%. What determines that level?
It would be up to the individual system, depending on which it is, whether it's the state employees retirement system versus the teacher's retirement system or the university system. So it would be up to the employer.
Thank you.
All right, I want to step back for a minute and just to get a big picture sense of the budget here. The total revenues that you are estimating we're going to garner in the general revenue fund for fiscal year 18 are what?
Estimated to be $32.7 billion.
And there's not any new revenue estimate in that. That's all current generated sources that we have and just what we expect them to be next fiscal year?
That is correct. Under current state law, the governor is required to present a budget based upon current revenues.
Yep. And your spending level that is presented here for the general revenue fund, what is that total?
Yes, the governor's put forth a budget proposal that prioritizes spending under a balanced budget framework that would include enacting structural changes to add jobs, to grow the economy, working with the General Assembly on that, as well as additional spending reductions. And then if those two things are in place, the governor would be open to adding new revenues for a ceiling of $37.3 billion.
So what I saw in the budget book then is a proposed spending base of the $37.3 billion. Is that accurate?
His balanced budget proposes to align revenues with expenditures and has prioritized the spending in his budget book at the $37.3 billion spending level.
Right. With current revenues at the $32.7 billion, so there's the gap there of about $4.6 billion that reads working together on grand bargain. Is that the filler there? Is that, you know, the way to balance it? Is this grand bargain amount, I'm presuming?
As the governor mentioned in his budget address yesterday, yes, his preferred option and what he thinks is most important for a long-term budget solution is to make structural changes to grow the economy, to add jobs, and with that, working with the General Assembly with spending reductions, he would be open to new revenues. He's said that for 2 years.
Does this proposal do anything to address the, you know, currently we have, I think yesterday on the comptroller website, it's about $11.9 billion in unpaid bills. How does this proposal address that backlog of bills?
There is no new money that is proposed to pay down the bill backlog, but under a balanced budget, the governor would be open to financing options to pay down a portion of the backlog.
Okay. How much are we spending? What's the estimate for this current fiscal year that it's costing us to have this backlog of bills in terms of prompt interest payment? And what is that prompt interest payment amount that we're spending? Like, what's the rate, and how much in total is it costing us in the state this year, estimated?
Okay. The current rate, there's prompt payment interest that after 90 days it accrues at 1% per month. Timely pay interest starts accruing 30 days, and that is at a 9% rate. The state employee group health insurance program is the bulk of the interest liabilities. COGFA did put out a report in January on the state employee group health insurance, and their estimate for the amount of interest accrued to date is $350 million.
And that's just to date, so that's not for the entire fiscal year what the estimate would be?
Correct.
And so it sounded like from what we were saying it's 1% per month. Most of the group health backlog is well over a year, so we're paying 12% interest on it. Is that about the rate that gets paid on what's owed to the group health folks, for example?
No, the state employee group health insurance is a mixture of both the timely pay interest at the 9% rate as well as the prompt pay interest at the 12%. It's a blend depending upon the providers. So someplace
between 9 and 12%.
That's correct.
And if we went out to try to do something to bring that backlog down, bonding it out or whatnot, do you think, how much would we have to pay, how much would it cost us, do you think? Would it cost us below that 9 to 12% blended rate that we're paying right now?
There would be a savings.
So is that something that you would, in fact, do you think, recommend as helpful for an approach to one of the things to deal with that backlog of bills?
Yes, I think if there is a grand bargain in which the budget is balanced and it includes spending reductions and enacting structural changes to achieve a balanced budget, under that framework, yes, the governor is open to financing a portion of the bill backlog.
And do you also have a supplemental assumed in here for fiscal year 17? I know currently Human service agencies and higher education, amongst others, don't have any appropriation authority for this half of the year. Are you recommending a supplemental for fiscal year 17? It sort of looked like that was presumed in some of these numbers I was seeing.
Yes, in the governor's budget book, there is information that is being presented that under the assumption that we are able to achieve a balanced budget for fiscal year 2018, and that will be in place, that we would be open to additional resources to appropriate money to state government in those areas to bring their funding level up to a maintenance level for fiscal year 2017, and those numbers are presented in the governor's budget book.
And can you just tell me what are you using as that maintenance level?
That is basically what is been determined by GOMB, working with the state agencies on what their spending needs will be for FY17 in order for them to continue to administer and operate their core programs and services.
I'm going to turn it over to let some other folks come. I may come back at the end. I saw Senator McGuire, then Senator Bennett.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Good morning.
Good morning.
You mentioned that the governor's proposed budget would fund higher education at 90% of FY15. And yesterday, the governor mentioned that he wishes to increase the appropriation for MAP grants by 10%, which would seem to be to a total of $401 million. As you know, there's no MAP grant, there's no MAP funding for the current academic year. So students in their schools who were promised MAP grants, 120,000 students in all, have received no MAP grant funding for the recently concluded fall semester nor for the current spring semester. So what is the administration's plan to fulfill its promise to those students and their schools?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. The sooner that the General Assembly and the governor come to an agreement on a balanced budget, obviously that will provide the ability for funding for very critical programs. Obviously, the governor has allocated and recommending an increase to the monetary award program. He recognizes that it's a very important program for financial assistance to students, and so the sooner that a balanced budget is in place for fiscal year 2018, that will then allow us to then also begin to appropriate funding for critical programs such as MAP.
So could we get chronological about that? So if the balanced budget you mentioned is achieved in June, when do you anticipate that the FY17 backfill for MAP would occur?
I don't know. I don't want to speculate on when a grand bargain will be reached as far as a date. I will say that the sooner that a grand bargain is reached, the better off the state of Illinois' finances will be.
And are you in touch with Illinois' public universities and community colleges and nonprofit schools regarding the impact on them of the absence of MAP for this current fiscal year?
Yes.
And have they mentioned to you how long they can hold on without MAP funding?
I don't know specifically to the MAP program.
The reports we're hearing from the field is that at least several of our state universities will be severely challenged open next year without MAP funding plus their operating grants. Last year, of course, we passed a $600 million higher ed supplemental in April. I've been told by higher education leaders that should we need to do that again, we'd better do it before April. So that's why I asked you to get chronological, because if indeed the fulfillment of the state's promise to those 120,000 MAP students doesn't occur until midsummer, that could mean casualties. Thank you.
Senator Bennett, and then Senator Bertino-Tarrant and Senator Hastings.
Thank you, Chairman. And thank you, Director, for being here today. You made a comment earlier about public sector healthcare plans being overly generous, and that was, I think, a similar phrase that the governor has used on repeated occasions. Do you have any metrics for that? Because I'll tell you, when I came to the legislature a few years before, I was at a small private firm and noticed very little difference between what we paid in for insurance and the benefits we received. So if you look at some of the private, larger private employers in the state farms, the Caterpillars, do you have some metrics of that, looking at the state benefits and how much they pay in compared to the private? And if so, I mean, has the governor shared that in the past and I just missed it?
Yes, that has been included in the governor's budget book in the past. It's also included in his fiscal year 2018 budget book. The average private sector plan coverage in Illinois is about $5,000 more compared to the state's plan.
Okay. And here's where my district includes the University of Illinois, and here's where I would differ with you on being overly generous. And here's where I think that $11 billion in unpaid bills is pretty important. Because in the University of Illinois, they're covered by public and, obviously public sector insurance. Used to be considered good insurance. The problem is, because the state is so behind in paying its vendors, that same insurance, they're still employed, they're still, they've got the card in their wallet. But for example, parents that have children that need catheters, the old medical suppliers that used to give don't deal with Illinois anymore. So now they come to my office with giant binders to say, okay, now I track down a company in Ohio. It's more money. It's actually costing the state more money because people now put a surcharge to deal with the state of Illinois, things like that. And so now they're on their third or fourth or fifth medical supply company with the same insurance company because nobody wants to deal with the state anymore. And I guess my question is, knowing that it's putting state employees through this, knowing that we are paying on this $11 billion between 9 and 12%, far over market value, market rate for this, why is this not a priority for the governor in this budget? Why are we willing to talk past the $11 billion and say, if you get a balanced budget, we'll maybe come back and talk about it in some vague term? Why is the governor not saying, as the Senate has in its grand bargain, we need to address this at the very beginning, because $11 billion will soon become 12, 13, 14. It's affecting our citizens, it's affecting our vendors, and it's a usurious interest rate. Can you talk to why that isn't more of a priority for the governor?
Sure. Obviously, the state finances is a priority to the governor, but it's important for us to have a balanced budget in place before we add new debt payments for financing for a portion of the bill backlog.
Okay. But it's not something that the governor's willing to mention any specifics of at this point. It's a carrot kind of hanging off in the distance if there's a balanced budget. Is that fair to say?
No, I think there were very good discussions last spring and last summer with both the House and the Senate, rank and file lawmakers, as well as from both parties, that the overall budget framework that was in the budget working group did spend quite a bit of time talking about a bill backlog debt issuance as part of a balanced budget framework. So there has been a lot of discussions with that between both parties.
I have no doubt there's discussions. That's why it's been included in the grand bargain proposal as one of their actual bills. I'm curious as to why the governor isn't taking part in those discussions by actually talking about it as part of his budget proposal.
I think simply it's just the budget needs to be balanced before we can add additional debt.
Okay. Finally, the governor continued his pattern of adding in institutional changes and then adding them in the budget as if they were real-time savings on pension reform, on health care reforms, well, term limits. But is there any legislation that you're aware of? Who's sponsoring these bills at this point? I mean, it's one thing to say we'll change the pensions. Is this in bill form yet?
It is not in bill form yet.
Okay. Do you anticipate that it's, close, or who's going to sponsor it, or do you have any of that information yet?
I would have to defer to the policy and the legislative office team on that.
Okay. So is it fair to say the governor's a little bit out in front of his skis on this a little bit? He's already added it in his budget as if they're real savings, but it's not even drafted as a bill, nor do you have a sponsor?
No, these are proposals by the governor that are outlined in his budget book that would help the state of Illinois to prioritize spending and addressed high spending areas for some savings so that we can achieve a balanced budget.
Okay, thank you.
It sounded like, I just want to do a quick follow-up, and then it's Senator Bertino-Tarrant, that you were suggesting that you didn't want to include the borrowing, the plan to maybe, bond out to pay off the backlog of bills in here because until we have a balanced budget. Is that an acknowledgement that this proposal is not a balanced budget then?
No.
You have other things in here that, you say are getting it to a balanced budget.
The governor's budget proposal is balanced.
Then
But
why
we-
wouldn't include that?
The governor's budget proposal does not have the bill backlog included in it, and his proposal is to reach an agreement with the General Assembly on an overall grand bargain, and as part of that grand bargain package, he would be open to the consideration of including it.
Yeah, it feels a little bit of punt work going on here in terms of leaving it to the General Assembly here and the Senate really to do the job to get us a balanced budget, which I think we do so urgently need. So it's something I'm hoping we actually do because somebody needs to actually do it. Senator Bertino-Tarrant.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Hello, Director Harry. I'm Jennifer Bertino-Tarrant, Senator in the 49th District. Welcome. I want to talk to you a little bit about the Tier 3, just so I can understand it. And I'll just go at the teacher level. So I'm a new teacher. I'm starting school, or starting my new job, and I'm going to have a choice between a Tier 2 and a Tier 3, or am I automatically going to put into this new Tier 3?
This would offer a choice to you to choose either Tier 2 or Tier 3.
Do we have any idea of a number, knowing that we may not know what new teachers are going to do, what an estimated savings we're going to have with this new pension tier?
The savings would be associated with either the new employee choosing Tier 2 or Tier 3, and that estimate is $500 million in savings in the fiscal year 2018 pension payments.
If they go to a tier, is that an assumption that most of them will go into a Tier 3?
No, it does not matter
Okay.
whether they choose Tier 2 or Tier 3. The pension costs will be paid by the local employer whether they choose either the existing Tier 2 or the new Tier 3.
Okay, so that is going to be, the cost shift is then going to be part of whether they choose Tier 2 or Tier 3.
That's correct.
Okay. Can you tell me how that works then with the governor's property tax freeze? If we're freezing our taxes, and now we're going to add to school districts the cost of pensions to our community colleges, to some areas, universities. Is there a thought process on how we're going to freeze property taxes and then put these costs back on the employer?
Right. Yes, the governor has proposed changes for local government consolidation to reduce costs at the local level, as well as addressing unfunded mandates and removing mandates to save, make savings at the local government level. And so that he has been open with proposals on that.
All right. So will this be in conjunction, or, is it possible that we're going to have a Tier 3 without those mandates actually moving forward?
So
Unfunded mandates.
So the cost shift would be gradual moving forward to allow the local employers more time to adjust budgets and plan for this.
Okay. I think we're going to have a lot of nervous school districts and municipalities right now. I have some questions on the education budget, but I will defer. Are we going to have Dr. Purvis separately, or are we going to put it all together?
If she's willing to, we can. And so why don't we stick with Director Harry
Yeah, I'll
now,
ask him,
and
and
then
if you
we'll
may
come
not,
back. Is that
I didn't
okay?
know if we are going to have a whole
Yeah,
separate.
no.
I was going to wait for my question.
Sure, you got it.
I may have written some of my numbers wrong here. We have an additional, what I'm understanding is additional $30 million in K through 12.
For general state aid.
Yes. early childhood, and I'm going from what was proposed fiscal year 17, 50 million in early childhood.
Correct.
Okay, and then 5 million in matching funds for internet. So I'm just going to stick with the K through 12, the 30 million. And I'm just curious, and this probably will be directed to you, Dr. Purvis, because you've spent numerous hours, probably more than you care to talk about right now. And I told you this personally. I give you tremendous credit. You had patience, much more than I would have. Does this $30 million, is it consistent with what we are doing now, or are any of these recommendations that we took so long discussing, are any of them in here?
Well, Senator, thank you for the question. So I think, first of all, the proposal, because there is not a new school funding formula in statute, is based on the current school funding formula. So I think in the governor's proposal, we tried to take the recommendations to the extent possible that came out of the School Funding Formula Commission. So, for example, you know, as a member of this commission, that one of the goals was child first. So if you look at the way that this is put forward, the hold harmless would be on a per pupil basis, not on a district enrollment basis. So we really want to look at that hold harmless by student, which I think is important. Number two, I think we had some robust conversations about the proration of dollars for English learners. And given that we have a huge increase in English learners in our state, and it is important that those scholars get the support that they need, that the end of proration of those dollars, and I believe that's an increase of $38 million. Again, there has been proration of transportation. So fully funding that transportation line, which will help every district in the state. And again, a focus of the administration is we really want to support students as they are both college and career ready, and knowing that those transportation dollars are also important for students who are transported to and from CTE. That is a $145 million increase. The $30 million increase is to the GSA to try to hold harmless, again, to end proration of that. So I believe that when we look at the English learning, the importance of transportation, also the $5 million, although a small amount, is to leverage over $140 million in federal dollars. Over the last 2 years, we've increased the connectivity of our districts across the state from 71% of our districts at the connectivity level that with the infrastructure they need to be connected for 21st century learning. We've moved that all the way to 84%. We want to leverage those federal dollars through our E-rate matching funds, which we have not really taken advantage of as a state, and we have 2 years to leverage those dollars. So that $5 million will help us leverage those dollars going forward. Now, I also want to say that if a new school funding formula is passed that reflects the work of the bipartisan bicameral committee, the governor is very ready to take the investments that are put forward here, this additional $250 million, and to put that into the new funding formula. But again, because we don't have a new funding formula in statute, we thought it was important to address some of the issues in the current funding formula and to do so in a way that reflects the conversations of the committee.
Just a quick follow-up. So you said that you weren't reflecting changes in the way you're distributing it because we haven't passed legislation. Yet there's savings reflected in this budget from legislation that has not been passed for pension reform, for procurement reform, for a whole bunch of other things. So what is how are you guys coming to prioritize what is and was not included in here based on whether legislation currently exists, statute currently exists or not? I'm just not following how those decisions were made.
Well, from the education, I'll let Director Harry answer from the larger number, but we know that there are, and we are, hopeful to see the outcomes of the bipartisan conversations going on both in the House and the Senate. We are looking at the bill that was filed in the Senate by Representative Davis, but we want to make sure that we are being respectful of that process as that's coming forward. But again, we wanted to make sure also for our school districts that we take the conversations that were reflected in the bipartisan bicameral funding commission and try to address those areas, especially where proration has really hurt districts from in those areas of transportation and English learners, and we think that is very reflective of those conversations.
Yeah, but that doesn't answer my question in terms of why this one's not when other things are. Overall, how are you making decisions on what the priorities are that you think should be reflected in here versus what aren't?
Sure, Senator. The savings proposals for the state spending for items such as pensions, state employee group health insurance, procurement, these are not new proposals in the fiscal year 2018 budget. These things have been in all three of the governor's introduced budgets, and these things have also, pension reforms and procurement reforms have been discussed and introduced in the General Assembly and even prior years before Governor Rauner.
Okay, so we're not supposed to take that that's more of a priority than anything else then? Things that are in here versus aren't? That's not reflecting a sense of priorities, that those are more important than things that aren't in here?
Well, I think it's important to say that the governor, again, in this budget has proposed an increase in funding of $250 million, which will represent almost $1 billion in increased spending in pre-K-12 education over 3 years. So I think after cuts in pre-K-12 education from 2009 to 2015, I think this very much reflects the governor's priority of pre-K-12 education. I think the governor has been very clear that he hopes that we reach a new school funding formula that better defines adequacy and approaches equity. And we think that by increasing by again another $250 million this year, that the governor is showing his priority in making sure that we improve outcomes for children across the state.
Senator Hastings?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And Director Harry, thanks for being here. Congratulations on your new role. We're really excited that you're here. Is your legislative team here?
No.
Are they planning on coming?
This is my budget team is here.
Good. So let's just start with some simple questions again, because I just want to make sure that the numbers are reiterated. What is the total spending under the governor's current budget proposal?
The spending number for reaching a grand bargain is...
No. I just want the number. How much is it?
The spending number?
The spending number.
The recommended governor's budget is $37.3 billion.
What's the revenues for fiscal year 18 that you anticipate? Given, right now, no legislation, no assumptions. How much is it?
Right. As you know, under current state law...
Real quick, what's the number?
Under current state law, we're required to project revenues, and that projection is $32.7 billion.
What's the delta?
The difference between those two numbers are $4.5 billion.
How do you anticipate getting up to that level? $4.6 billion. How do you plan on getting from your revenues to your expenditures?
Again,
in terms of revenues, how do you plan on increasing revenues? Is that part of your plan?
The governor has said from day one that he is open to new revenues.
So he wants to raise taxes then. Is that true?
Madam Chair, I wonder if the witness could be allowed to answer the question before he gets two more.
I apologize.
Please?
I'll ask Gary a simple question.
Thank you.
You can answer me in a yes or no format so that we can speed along the process. Is it true that there's a difference between the expenditures and the revenues?
The governor's proposed...
I'm sorry, is it true that there's a difference between the expenditures and the revenues, about $4.6 billion? Is that correct?
The governor's introduced budget...
It's $4.6 billion.
His preferred option is to enact structural changes with the help of the General Assembly, with spending reductions, and to allow new revenues to be part of the solution for the balanced budget.
Do you acknowledge the fact that the governor is going to have to increase revenues to balance the budget?
The governor has also introduced his appropriation bills that are tied to the passage of the Unbalanced Budget Response Act, so that he has the authority to reduce items that are locked into statute, to match spending levels to the projected revenues.
So the governor will sign a revenue increase, is that correct?
No, I'm not saying that at all.
Okay, but he's considering that he would increase revenues, is that correct?
He is open to the idea of increased revenues under a grand bargain approach that includes enacting structural changes to grow the economy.
Let's talk about this grand bargain. How much input has the governor had in this grand bargain so far?
He has introduced last year's budget and this year's budget with that approach is his preferred option.
He's introduced the budget?
Yes.
Legislatively, he's introduced the budget, or just more along the lines of communicating his vision? Has he filed the bill? I'm asking about this year.
Yes, we filed appropriation bills yesterday, supplied them to legislative staff.
Who's filing them for you? Who's the sponsor?
It'd be Leader Radonio.
Leader Radonio, okay. Does that include a tax rate increase in that legislation?
No.
It does not.
No, the appropriation bills that are filed are tied to the passage of the Unbalanced Budget Response Act.
So there will be no tax bill in your guys' budget plan then to increase the revenues?
The governor does not want to just solely increase taxes by itself. That past approach has not worked. It has only gotten Illinois into more trouble. The governor, again, believes the most important thing is to improve the economy, to add jobs, that's going to be the long-term solution for the budget. And that is his proposal. He introduced a budget book yesterday. It's 570 pages, and it provides that path to a balanced budget.
Wonderful. So he makes a lot of assumptions, the governor. He assumes that the grand bargain will pass. And so my first question was, how much input of this grand bargain has the governor made? And you failed to answer the question. You failed to answer how much input has he had in the grand bargain? Has he helped out? Has he came up with any of these ideas? Has he crafted the legislation?
There were working groups last summer and even in the fiscal year 2016 budget that provided input with the General Assembly on those policy considerations for various structural changes. So yes, there was quite a bit of input.
So budgeting, you got to take into consideration all the external factors that could happen. What happens if the grand bargain doesn't move forward? How much would that cost? How much in addition would that cost to the state? How much would that be?
I don't have that figure off the top of my head, but the governor would
It should be in your budget because you assumed that the grand bargain would pass. So if it doesn't pass, you just back that number out, right?
No, the governor has introduced appropriation bills for the Unbalanced Budget Response Act that would allow him to effectively reduce spending to available current revenue, so there would be no deficit. The budget is balanced.
In the budget book, is there a caveat called working together, grand bargain?
Yes, that is discussed in the budget book.
How much do you estimate in savings in the budget book for grand bargain, working together?
The governor's introduced budget has a savings proposals of $3 billion that I outlined in my overview.
Okay, so the question I just asked you was, how much do you anticipate that it would increase the spending if there wasn't a grand bargain? And now you just told me that there's grand bargain numbers inside the budget book. Is that correct?
The governor's introduced budget assumes that it would be a mixture of three things, which would be enacting structural changes, growing the economy, as well as additional spending reductions and new revenues.
I understand that. I asked you a question about the grand bargain and how much it would save. You told me you didn't have the number. I asked you if in the budget book, working together, there was a caveat called the grand bargain and how much it would save. And how much would it save?
Again,
$3 billion, is that right? What was the number? I just want to know the number.
There are savings proposals of $3 billion.
Okay, so if the grand bargain doesn't pass, something happens where it doesn't pass in that current form, that $3 billion will be backed out. Is that correct?
If none of those proposals pass, yes, the savings would not be able to be achieved.
Thank you. The aggregate number then would be what? How much would the total spending of the state would be if the grand bargain doesn't pass?
The maintenance autopilot budget, if there were no changes in law, would have a deficit of $7.2 billion. But the governor has requested authority from the Unbalanced Budget Response Act to balance the budget. If the governor is given that authority to make spending reductions, the state will be in much better spot than letting the status quo continue and having courts and consent decrees dictate spending.
Thank you. Let's just go over a couple of the subparagraphs here so I can make sure I can tell my constituents back in the district what the governor actually proposed. Higher education. What's the governor's proposal for higher education?
The proposed funding level for higher education is $1.8 billion.
And then what was it last year?
In fiscal year 2016, $600 million.
What was the total expenditures last year? Are you increasing the spending on higher education or decreasing the spending?
Going from the 15 level, going from, yes, the 15 level
Let's
to...
go from 17. Let's start from 17 to 18. What's it going to be?
We do not have a full budget in place yet for FY17.
Okay.
Right now, higher education is funded at $1 billion, so it would be an $825 million increase.
Let's talk about maintenance, right? You said maintenance. What would the maintenance budget be on higher education?
For FY17?
For FY18?
For FY18, it would be $1.95 billion.
Define maintenance for me. What does maintenance mean?
That is based upon what the requests we've received from various agencies, and the introduced budget for the governor for 18 assumes a 10% reduction for higher ed.
Thank you. 10% reduction for higher ed. Okay.
For universities and community colleges.
Let's talk about human services really quick. What would maintenance be for human services for fiscal year 18?
$6.2 billion.
$6.2 billion. What's the governor's proposed?
$5.9 billion.
What's the reduction there?
It's about $230 million.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.